Eaton Fuller adjustment-free clutches, designed and engineered by Eaton Fuller. Check the Eaton Fuller medium-duty clutch application sheet for the proper application. Eaton Fuller stamped angle spring clutches should be replaced when adjustment cannot correct for a loss of free pedal or cannot compensate for a slipping clutch. Eaton Fuller solo clutches should be replaced when the wear indicating tab is at the replace position. Eaton has two versions of the Solo, one for standard stroke linkages and one for short stroke linkages. The short stroke Solo is designed for use with hydraulic type linkages and also the GM truck cable linkage system. Of these two types of Solo clutches, you have a choice between the original Solo or the maintenance-free version, both available in a single or double disc model. The original version uses a common release yoke combined with a greasable release bearing. This non-sealed bearing requires lubrication every 10,000 miles using an EP number 2 grease. On the other hand, the maintenance-free version requires the use of a special roller yoke combined with a lubed for life release bearing. This sealed bearing requires no further lubrication. The roller yoke is packaged with the clutch. For further details, refer to the medium-duty application guide. Attach either a sling or jack to the transmission. Next, remove the transmission mounting bolts and disconnect the external clutch linkage, making sure the release yoke will clear the release bearing as you move the transmission rearward. Don't let the rear of the transmission drop or hang unsupported. The discs can be bent or distorted, thus preventing the clutch from releasing cleanly should you desire to reuse it. Install a spline aligning tool through the release bearing, into the driven discs, and also into the inner race of the flywheel pilot bearing. You can use an old transmission input shaft for this purpose. If the clutch being replaced is a 2-plate angle spring, pull the bearing back using the release tool shown and insert 2 5/8" thick shipping blocks. If the clutch is a single plate angle spring, insert 2 1 3/4" thick shipping blocks on the single plate model. This will prevent breaking the retainer and keep the levers from coming out of the retainer slot. Installing the wooden shipping blocks also helps ensure that the clutch will release cleanly should you wish to reinstall it. If you are removing a Solo, do not unbolt the clutch from the flywheel unless you first install 4 shipping resetting bolts. The medium-duty 14-inch Solo uses size 3/8" by 16 by 1 1/4" coarse thread. Install the bolts finger tight plus 1 turn. Now you can carefully remove the clutch. The out-of-the-truck resetting procedure will be described later in this video. Failure to first install the 4 shipping bolts prior to the clutch's removal from the flywheel will necessitate the use of this resetting procedure. Remove 2 of the mounting bolts at the top of the clutch cover and install 2 guide studs in their place. Take out the remaining 6 mounting bolts and carefully remove the clutch. Since this part is heavy, you may want to use a hoist to ensure easier handling of the clutch. If you need to temporarily remove a Solo clutch, the following 9-step procedure must be performed prior to the clutch's removal from the flywheel. Failure to perform these steps will cause the Solo to drag or to not release upon reinstallation. Note, if the wear indicating tab is at or near the replace position, you can disregard the following 9-step process and install a new Solo clutch at this time. Also, if the Solo clutch was removed without first installing the 4 shipping bolts and you now wish to reinstall the clutch, you must perform the out-of-truck resetting procedures described later in this video. The first step in the removal and reinstallation of a Solo clutch is to fully depress the clutch pedal and hold at this position. Next, slide the wear indicating tab to the far left and hold at this new position. Let up on the clutch pedal. The tab will remain at the new position. Carefully remove the transmission, being sure to support its weight so that no damage will occur to the release bearing assembly and driven discs. Install 4 3/8" by 16 by 1 1/4" coarse thread machine screws finger tight. Using a 9/16" wrench, tighten each bolt one turn. These 4 shipping bolts will cage the pressure plate, thus preventing the 4 plate spacers from moving out of position during the clutch's removal from the flywheel. Carefully remove the clutch from the flywheel, being sure to mark all the clutch parts so they can be properly oriented during reinstallation. Inspect the ceramic buttons and their mating parts for an oily or grease-covered condition, being sure to eliminate the source of this contamination before the clutch is reinstalled. Please note, Eaton Fuller does not recommend the reuse of contaminated discs. You must replace with new discs. Using a 9/16" wrench, progressively tighten the 4 shipping bolts in a crisscross pattern until the face of the pressure plate is 525 thousandths of an inch minimum below the mounting surface. Important: failure to perform this step properly may cause the Solo clutch to drag or to not release upon reinstallation. Reinstall the clutch according to the Solo installation procedures shown later in this video, being careful to properly reorient the clutch parts. Inspect the mating surfaces of both the flywheel housing and the transmission bell housing. Any appreciable wear on either housing will cause misalignment. Most wear will be found on the lower half of these surfaces, with the most common wear areas between the 3 and 8 o'clock positions. Replace the clutch housing if it is worn. Before you begin the following run-out checks, remove the 2 guide studs installed earlier and also make sure that all gauging surfaces have been wiped clean. Begin the first run-out check by securing the dial indicator's base to the engine housing with the gauge finger on the face of the flywheel. Rotate the flywheel 1 full revolution. For a Solo clutch, the maximum allowable total run-out is 7 thousandths. Proceed to the second run-out check by moving the gauge finger so that it contacts the pilot bearing bore surface. Again, rotate the flywheel 1 full revolution. The maximum total allowable run-out is 1/2 thousandth. Begin the third run-out check by securing the dial indicator's base to the center of the flywheel. Next, move the gauge finger until it contacts the flywheel housing pilot. Rotate the flywheel 1 full revolution and mark the high and low points. The total indicated difference between the high and low points must be 8 thousandths or less. For the fourth and final run-out check, secure the dial indicator's base to the outer edge of the flywheel and then move the gauge finger until it contacts the face of the flywheel housing. Again, rotate the flywheel 1 full revolution while you mark the high and low points. The total run-out should not exceed 8 thousandths. If any of the 4 previous limits are exceeded, the problem must be corrected, or the resulting misalignment will cause disc damper failures and potential damage to other drivetrain components. This completes the inspection portion of the clutch job. A closer look at Solo's components reveals how Eaton's engineers have been able to create an adjustment-free clutch. Critical to the clutch's success are its pressure plate and plate spacers, which are exclusive to the Solo design. There are 4 plate spacers located symmetrically about the Solo. The plate spacers assure proper plate separation throughout the life of the clutch and sense the need for clutch adjustment. Solo also includes patented cams made of a strong composite material that withstands the harshest of conditions. And because there are no threads, the possibility of frozen rings is eliminated. Atop the cams is a wear indicating tab that mirrors the movement of the cams. This highly visible tab can be seen through an opening in the bell housing to determine the remaining clutch life. So how exactly does the revolutionary Solo work? When the installation process is completed, The transmission is installed as in the past, and the clutch linkage is hooked up. This is where it really gets easy. To set the clutch, just actuate the pedal in the cab 5 times. As the release yoke pulls the release bearing back, the cams set the release bearing to the proper position. The clutch linkage is then set to 1/8 inch between the yoke and the wear pads. Now the clutch is set, and with each ensuing push of the pedal, the cams adjust for any wear in the clutch. As wear occurs, the plate spacers will reset themselves to allow the cams to sense for wear. The plate spacers set on the engaged stroke to compensate for wear. The cams will reposition themselves on the next release stroke to compensate for the wear. When no clutch wear has taken place, the cams will not reposition. Install a new premium grade pilot bearing, C3 to C4 to C5 fit. Caution: tap on the outer race of the pilot bearing only and make sure it is seated properly in the bearing bore. This bearing must have a press fit. Install 2 guide studs, 3/8 inch by 16 thread by 3 inches long. Install the disc by inserting the aligning tool through the splines and then into the pilot bearing. Make sure the side-marked pressure plate side faces the pressure plate. With the aligning tool still in place, carefully slide the clutch assembly over the aligning tool and onto the 2 guide studs. Start 8 3/8 inch grade 5 or better mounting bolts with lock washers and tighten them finger tight. Using a torque wrench, progressively tighten the 8 bolts in a crisscross pattern by starting with the lower left-hand bolt. The final torque of each bolt should be 30 to 35 pounds-foot. Failure to tighten the bolts in this manner can cause permanent damage to the clutch cover, creating an out-of-balance condition, or cause the release bearing to be stuck rearward toward the nose of the transmission. Remove the 4 yellow-colored shipping resetting bolts in progressive crisscross pattern. This will allow the pressure plate to move toward the engine and will clamp the disc to the flywheel. Save these bolts for future resetting or removal of a solo. Do not tamper with the 4 plate spacer bolts located next to each shipping bolt. They are designed for factory use only. Remove the aligning tool. Installation of the Solo 1401 clutch is now complete. Install a new premium grade pilot bearing, C3 to C4 to C5 fit. Caution: tap on the outer race of the pilot bearing only and make sure it is seated properly in the bearing bore. This bearing must have a pressed fit. Install 2 guide studs, 3/8 inch by 16 thread by 3 inches long. Install the front disc by inserting the aligning tool through the splines and then into the pilot bearing. Make sure the side marked flywheel side faces the flywheel. Install the intermediate plate assembly over the 2 guide studs and slide it forward until it touches the flywheel. Make sure the side-marked pressure plate side is facing the pressure plate. The drive straps must face the pressure plate. Also, make sure the 4 positive separator pins in the intermediate plate are flush on the side that faces the pressure plate, protruding on the side that faces the engine flywheel. Remove the aligning tool and install it through the splines of the rear disc. Insert the aligning tool through the front disc and then into the pilot bearing. Make sure the side of the disc marked pressure plate side is facing the pressure plate. As you perform this step, align the buttons of the front and rear discs as closely as possible. Doing so will aid the function of the positive separator pins. With the aligning tool still in position, carefully slide the clutch assembly over the aligning tool and the 2 guide studs until it rests against the intermediate plate assembly. Start 8 3/8-inch grade 5 or better mounting bolts with lock washers and tighten them finger tight. Using a torque wrench, progressively tighten the 8 bolts in a crisscross pattern by starting with the lower left-hand bolt. The final torque of each bolt should be 35 to 40 pounds-foot. Failure to tighten the bolts in this manner can cause permanent damage to the clutch cover or create an out-of-balance condition. Remove the 4 yellow-colored shipping resetting bolts in a progressive crisscross pattern. This will allow the pressure plate to move toward the engine and clamp the discs to the flywheel. Save these bolts for future resetting or removal of a Solo. Do not tamper with the 4 plate spacer bolts located next to each shipping bolt. They are designed for factory use only. You may now remove the aligning tool. Using a lightweight hammer and a 1/4 inch flat-nosed punch, lightly tap the 4 positive separator pins via the access holes on the clutch cover until each pin is touching the flywheel. Failure to set these pins properly will cause the clutch to drag, resulting in a poor release complaint. Installation of the Solo 1402 clutch is now complete. Before installing the transmission, make sure it has been shifted into gear. If the truck is equipped with a non-synchronized transmission, install a new Eaton Fuller clutch brake at this time, being sure to check the front of the transmission bearing cap for excessive wear. Replace the cap if worn excessively. Clutch brakes will never be used with synchronized transmissions. Check the release yoke fingers for excessive wear. Replace if worn excessively. Coat the yoke fingers with grease to prolong the life of both the fingers and also the wear pads on the release bearing. Check the cross shafts and bushings for excessive wear. Replace if worn excessively. Make sure the cross shafts do not protrude through the release yoke, since this could cause a side-loading condition between the release bearing sleeve and the transmission input shaft. Excessive wear at the cross shafts and bushings can also lead to a side-loading condition, which may result in a poor release complaint. There should be 0 wear on the input shaft splines. Even slight wear can cause a non-release condition once the new driven discs have been installed over the worn splines. Do not apply grease or anti-seize on the input shaft. Use only a light coat of oil to aid in installation. Check for worn linkage pivot points. Replace any parts which are worn excessively. If you have installed a maintenance-free version of the Solo clutch, you must install the roller-type yoke package with this clutch. It is a specially designed release yoke which will function only with the maintenance-free Solo. Important: the roller yoke must be installed with the engine side notation facing the engine. Make sure that the transmission is square to and aligned with the engine when it is raised into position. Lift the release yoke so that it clears and is rotated over the wear pads of the release bearing as the transmission is moved forward. Be careful. The release yoke fingers must not be elevated to the straight out position. Both the clutch cover and release yoke fingers can become damaged when moving the transmission forward. Move the transmission forward, but never, and we repeat, never force the transmission into the clutch cover or flywheel housing. If it doesn't enter freely, investigate the cause and make any necessary changes. Do not use the clutch release arm to pull the transmission into the engine housing. Doing so will cause the release bearing to adjust too closely to the transmission bearing cap or clutch brake. As a result, you might experience a dragging clutch due to shortened bearing travel. Do not let the rear of the transmission drop or hang unsupported in the driven discs. The discs can be bent or distorted and will cause a no-release condition or broken damper disc. Mate the transmission with the engine flywheel housing and install the mounting bolts. Torque the bolts based upon the manufacturer's recommendations. This completes the transmission portion of the clutch job. To properly set up the Solo, the yoke must move the release bearing until one of the following occurs. 1. The bearing hits the transmission nose. 2. The bearing hits the clutch brake. This is for non-synchronized transmissions. 3. The bearing cannot be further moved and has hit the internal stop of the clutch cover. Adjust the truck linkage until you have zero clearance between the release bearing wear pads and release yoke. Setting the yoke to contact the bearing pads will allow for maximum stroke to the bearing and allow the clutch to set itself to the specific truck. The bearing must move slightly more than 9/16 of an inch in order for the Solo to adjust fully. Fully depress and release the clutch pedal in the cab 5 times. Indications that the Solo is adjusting will be 1. A gain in the free pedal in the cab. 2. Movement of the wear indicator on the clutch away from the new position slightly toward the replace position. 3. The release bearing seats itself closer to the transmission nose. Note, the Solo will set itself based on the distance you pull the bearing. Do not attempt to adjust the bearing position by prying or hitting on the wear indicator, for it is easily broken off. In addition, manually moving the wear indicating tab will not alter the final position of the release bearing. The wear indicator is a visual indication of when to replace the clutch. If the tab has been broken, it has no effect on the function or life of the clutch. If the bearing movement is not stopped at the end of the stroke by the transmission, clutch brake, or internal stop, again reset the yoke clearance to 0 and again depress and release the pedal 5 times. Any gain in free play in the clutch pedal indicates that this second adjustment was necessary. The Solo should now be fully adjusted. The next step is to adjust the truck linkage and create a minimum of 1/16 inch clearance between the release yoke fingers and the bearing pads. This setting will create the correct free pedal in the cab. In some trucks, the pedal may stop off the floor. This is an acceptable condition and is a result of a linkage designed for maximum bearing movement. However, if you prefer to lower the pedal at the end of the stroke, you must reduce the total in-cab pedal movement. For example, if you have a 12-inch pedal movement, lower the pedal 1 inch to create an 11-inch pedal movement. This will lower the pedal by 1 inch at the end of the stroke. You may need to modify or adjust the upper pedal stop bumper. Now reset the 1/16 inch minimum clearance between the release yoke and bearing. If a clutch brake is used, verify that the clutch brake squeeze begins approximately 1/2 inch to 1 inch from the end of the pedal stroke. Adjusting the linkage to decrease the amount of free travel will increase the amount of clutch brake squeeze. Inversely, adjusting the linkage to increase the amount of free travel will decrease the amount of clutch brake squeeze. Note, clutch brake squeeze should be verified by inserting a 10/1000 feeler gauge between the bearing and clutch brake. Lubricate the release bearing until lube purges out of the opening onto the transmission shaft. This will lube the bearing and bushing. Apply lube to the release yoke fingers as well as the cross shafts. If you can access the external clutch arm attached to the cross shaft, you can use the alternative setup procedure. Place a pipe or tool over the release arm and rotate the cross shaft to move the release bearing toward the transmission until it stops. The bearing should be moved until it contacts the transmission nose, hits the clutch brake, or is limited by the internal stop inside the clutch. Repeat this procedure 5 times. Indications that the Solo is adjusting will be 1. Movement of the wear tab from the new position slightly toward the replace position. 2. The release bearing will seat itself closer to the transmission nose. And 3. There will be an increase in free play at the clutch pedal. Now install the truck linkage. Adjust the linkage to set the clearance between the release yoke fingers and the release bearing pads to a minimum of 1/16 inch. This will create the correct free pedal in the cab. Note, the Solo will set itself based on the distance you pull the bearing. Do not attempt to adjust the bearing position by prying or hitting on the wear indicator, for it is easily broken off. Also, manually moving the wear indicating tab will not alter the final position of the release bearing. The wear indicator is a visual indication of when to replace the clutch. If the tab has been broken, it has no effect on the function or life of the clutch. If a clutch brake is used, verify that the clutch brake squeeze begins approximately 1/2 inch to 1 inch from the end of the pedal stroke. Adjusting the linkage to decrease the amount of free travel will increase the amount of clutch brake squeeze. Inversely, adjusting the linkage to increase the amount of free travel will decrease the amount of clutch brake squeeze. Lubricate the release bearing until lube purges out of the opening onto the transmission input shaft. Including the release bearing, this excess grease will also prolong the life of the bronze bushing inside the release sleeve. Do not be concerned if grease gets onto the clutch brake, since it will not affect the brake's ability to stop the input shaft. Apply lube to the release yoke fingers, as well as the cross shafts. The following resetting procedure is necessary if you 1. Remove the clutch from the flywheel without first installing the 4 shipping bolts, and 2. Now wish to reinstall the Solo clutch. Failure to observe the following resetting procedures will prevent the clutch from releasing upon reinstallation. Please note, for future reference, this information is also available in the installation and adjustment wall charts packaged with each Solo clutch. Support the clutch in an arbor press, allowing approximately 1 inch of space beneath the release bearing. Center the ram and move the retainer downward until you can slide the wear indicating tab to the new position. Caution: to prevent damage between the Solo's internal stop and the clutch cover, do not overstroke the retainer assembly. While holding the tab at its new position, install 4 3/8 by 16 by 1 1/4 inch coarse thread shipping bolts until they are finger tight. A magnet can be used to hold the tab while installing these bolts. You may now retract the arbor press ram. Using a 9/16 inch wrench, progressively hand tighten these 4 shipping bolts until the face of the pressure plate is a minimum of 525 thousandths below the cover's mounting surface. This will allow the 4 plate spacers to be repositioned. Note: failure to perform this step properly may cause the Solo clutch to drag or to not release upon reinstallation. For additional technical information, refer to both the installation and adjustment wall chart packaged with each Solo clutch and the troubleshooting manual. Warning: the major cause of clutch failure is excessive heat. Excessive heat generated from the flywheel, driven discs, intermediate plate, and pressure plate can cause the metal to flow and the friction material to be destroyed. If this occurs, the clutch can burst, resulting in property damage, serious bodily injury, or death. Recommended vehicle loads should not be exceeded. The clutch should be used only for recommended applications. Drivers should be properly trained in the starting, shifting, and operation of the clutch. Drivers should report erratic clutch operation as soon as possible to permit maintenance personnel to inspect, adjust, or lubricate as required. Mechanics must be familiar with the proper clutch adjustment, linkage adjustment, lubrication, and other maintenance and troubleshooting procedures outlined in the Failure Analysis Guide and the Eaton Service Manual.